Gerald Steinberg, NGOs and human.
I don't think that when Alvin agreed to accept my paper, that he realized, I wish I could make this bigger, but I can't, so hopefully you'll be able to see it this way, that I am at the center of a vast conspiracy. This is, you're trying to tell me something, this is a cover, the blue thing is a cover of a series of over 20 articles published by the Swedish International Development Agency magazine called Omvarlden. I'm sure I pronounced that wrong. And thank you, whoever speaks Swedish here. This is you can see the originals, and then the English version in a couple of different formats. As I said, this is part 4 in the middle. There were over 20 of them, and it seems that by doing research and reporting on non-governmental organizations that are involved in political advocacy and happen to be also linked to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and also, which is a terrorist organization as defined, among others, by the European Union and by the United States and Canada, that what we end up with is a, okay, great, thanks. A vast conspiracy. It's interesting that when I submitted a complaint to the Ombudsman of the International Development Agency, they did remove the spiderweb image, and they left all the language the same, but they removed the spiderweb image while saying, no, this was not offensive or remotely indicating any kind of conspiratorial themes, but rather simply a response, a criticism of, or a response, and you can read the language. I will go on a little bit further just to show you the terrible things that I'm involved in. The head of the United Nations Office of the Commissioner for Humanitarian Affairs, OPT, the Occupied Palestinian Territories branch, a gentleman by the name of Jamie McGoldrick, has on a couple of occasions condemned both UN Watch and NGO Monitor for impacting the operating space of humanitarian actors and delegitimizing humanitarian action in Palestine, including allegations of misconduct and misuse of funds. We don't mind, as humanitarians, any type of scrutiny, but it has to be evidence-based. Okay, you're very lucky because I happen to have some evidence today. Misconduct, in particular, because we're at a conference on anti-Semitism, examples of activities which are undertaken by UN agencies, which are contradictory to the working definition of the IHRA working definition. And I thank very much the people who spoke before me, Mike and Leslie, for getting into some depth on the working definitions, how they evolved, and the claims that are made against them. What I'm going to do is not only talk about how important they are, but also to discuss ways of expanding these norms. And that's my basic approach. I don't deal with legal aspects. I don't, as an Israeli, the Israeli government doesn't have a problem with the working definition, of course. But the purpose of the work that I'm doing now, and my colleagues at NGO Monitor, is to try to expand the normative impact of the working definition, the IHRA working definition, particularly in the realms of the United Nations and of non-governmental organizations, many of which work very closely with these UN or frameworks and are often funded by or through those frameworks. So that's the focus of my presentation today. Why it's important to extend those norms to these two frameworks, the UN and the NGO community, and a little bit about how that might be accomplished over a period of time. There's some more. I'll start with some examples of where it's relevant. Many of these are in the form of Twitter screenshots. It's convenient and it's, I think, quite visual in that process. The example that I have here is from the OCHA OPT, which I just mentioned, which accuses NGO Monitor because of its research of undermining humanitarian organizations and not providing evidence to make that criticism. Well, one has to simply look at the support which the OCHA provides in its NGO allies and organizations that they work closely with to see a consistent support of BDS. I think later on today or tomorrow morning. I'm not going to make the case that BDS is anti-Semitic because that can be done by other people. Or maybe I'll show a couple of slides if I have time. But I'm making the assumption that BDS is anti-Semitic, as is the demonization of Israel, the singling out of Israel particularly. And this is the image here of wanton destruction that OCHA produces on a regular basis, as if there is absolutely no reason, no logic. This is simply destruction in order to oppress the Palestinians. You maybe can't see it, but there's a large bulldozer in the middle of this destroying a Palestinian construction, presumably a house, and this is part of the campaign that OCHA does on a regular basis. If I were to talk, I could do a full presentation, just or more than one, on the UN agencies, so this is not enough time, I'll just talk briefly about them. First of all, given that we are now about a week since the UN Human Rights Council indulged in its quarterly anti-Israel, what's called the Hate Fest, in which the majority of the attention and the condemnations are directed at Israel, as UN Watch points out, in the last session that ended last week, Israel was the focus of 7 individual reports, and the rest of the world, you can see how insignificant that was. This is, for me, an obvious example of singling out of Israel, which is in direct contradiction to the IHRA definitions, or is an example of the IHRA definitions. The United States cited this. Nikki Haley, when she was the ambassador, repeated it frequently, but it wasn't just Nikki Haley. Before her, even though the Obama administration talked about the Human Rights Council as being biased against Israel. And the British government has on a number of occasions, this was in the period of Boris Johnson. Mike, where are you sitting? If I make a small comment about the British government being dysfunctional, I hope you'll forgive me and other Brits in the room. But at one point, the British were quite focused on this issue of the bias inherent in the Human Rights Council and the singling out of Israel. Other examples, there are at least 7 different UN agencies that are operating intensely in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, all of which in different ways focus disproportionately on Israel in a critical way. I don't even have UNESCO on this list. Oh, I did put it on, okay. That's Shimon's area of expertise. But there are other organizations as well. UNRWA you all know about, or you should know about. The UNICEF Palestine, which has a working group of NGOs, a number of which are members of or connected directly to the PFLP terror organizations, and indulge in these kinds of singling out of Israel, in some cases Nazi-like analogies and other claims which are unacceptable under the working definition. In the image, what you see, and I realize it's not that particularly large, but a number of UN representatives, along with some diplomats, participated in what was called an art exhibition a few months ago that took place in a disputed, I'll just leave it at that, area called Khan al-Ahmar, which is in Area C and the road from Jerusalem out past Ma'ale Adumim. And what's significant for our purposes are the anti-Semitic caricatures which were on display at this Palestinian art fair, and the fact that it had a very strong UN presence, and none of the representatives who were at this art fair in any way publicly voiced any criticism of these particular works of art and the classic anti-Semitic motifs that are there. So this is a matter of silence, meaning consent. You're participating in a very blatant case of anti-Semitic propaganda, and it goes unremarked. I want to make a quick comment about the World Health Organization because of a discussion, I lost track of which day we're on here, I believe it was on Sunday, about the use of the charges, the accusations that Israel is responsible for malnutrition of Palestinians, particularly in Gaza, as a meme that repeats itself frequently. And the World Health Organization, in its annual reports every year, almost entirely based on NGO research or claims, repeats that theme. And it gets onto social media, and so we see that over and over again, as I said, through these international agencies. Many of them are involved in funding of BDS organizations. I mentioned the fact that UNICEF Palestine funds a number of organizations and works within its working group, has within its working NGO group organizations such as the Ecumenical Accompaniment Program for Palestinians in Israel, which I'll talk about in a minute, run by the World Council of Churches, Defense for Children International Palestine, and Adamir, all of which are involved actively in BDS. So this is the close links between the UN groups and the NGOs involved in BDS is quite striking. I'm going to not leave this on for very long. I assume most of you are familiar with the definition, the terms and the definitions, the contemporary examples of anti-Semitism, which are the ones that I'm focusing on. The use of symbols in addition to double standards, denying the Jewish people the right of self-determination, which we'll come back to in a minute. Also the symbols and images associated with classic anti-Semitism, which I just showed, were used in the Khan al-Ahmar art fair and are very frequent in a number of these Palestinian activities, and drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to the Nazis. So I want to now go through and look at some of these in specific cases and discuss ways in which these can be used as the basis for a campaign or for working to pressure the United Nations and these NGOs to take the IHRA definitions as norms. Now, I don't expect that to happen in the short term at all, but by putting this issue on the agenda and using these terms and the IHRA definition as means of assessing the activities of the UN agencies that I mentioned and of their NGO partners in these activities, I think that it can be used in an effective way to change some of the behavior, or at least call them to account. So having gone through some of the UN information, I'm now going to switch quickly to some of the major non-governmental organizations. Here, in addition to the new anti-Semitism or contemporary anti-Semitism linked to anti-Zionism, what we also have is we see the merger or the interaction between the old anti-Semitism, which is exemplified in a number of the activities of NGOs, which are quite visible. Amnesty in particular, here's one of a number of tweets that were posted by their UK campaigns manager, a gentleman by the name of Christian Benedict. And many of you, if you follow Amnesty, this was an infamous tweet back in 2014 during the Gulf War. He happens to focus on 3 Jewish MPs and connecting them to what Amnesty's campaign is on war crimes, talking about B-52s in Gaza. So linking those images together, he was reprimanded for a very short period of time. During that process, I believe he was suspended, and he was restored to his position very quickly, and continues to be a major part of the Amnesty anti-Israel campaign. Amnesty UK hosts events that minimize and negate Jewish suffering in the Holocaust. On a number of occasions, there have been proposals to include anti-Semitism on Amnesty's annual campaign list, and Amnesty inevitably rejects proposals to include that anti-Semitism on that agenda, or to issue reports, or to actively campaign on those issues. And that has become a significant issue, particularly among the organized Jewish community, the Board of Deputies of the UK, for not including anti-Semitism in its reports on bias and discrimination in society. Human Rights Watch, another major NGO which is involved in a lot of anti-Israel campaigning, and some of the examples that HRW has. This is one this is more closely related to the comparison of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. Again, an ad, I believe, from 2014, immediately after the Gaza war. This was a response to the sequence. This is, first of all, a tweet from the head of, first of all, the European media head of Amnesty, and then retweeted by the executive director, Ken Roth, who has, I call it an obsessive history of focusing and targeting Israel for close to 20 years. And this is an ad that was a response to another ad. The ad on your right side was one which Elie Wiesel was signed on to during the Gulf War, focusing on the way in which Hamas exploits children in its terror campaigns. And in response to that, a group of Holocaust survivors were put together, and there's a lot of controversy about who paid for this ad and how it was, whether in fact the Holocaust survivors knew what they were signing on to. I'll leave that's a side issue, but the fact that this ad was amplified and posted and retweeted by Human Rights Watch is a significant factor. The language that they've used is never again must mean never again for anyone. Holocaust survivors slam Israel on Gaza. And that's the contemporary, drawing comparisons between contemporary Israeli policy and that of the Nazis. A quick comment about BDS, and I think this came up in one of our discussions earlier, perhaps over a meal, about what makes BDS particularly anti-Semitic, and I said I'm not going to get into it in any depth, and I'll leave that to all the people in the room, Carrie and Ken Walter and others who've dealt with that issue and for tomorrow morning. But I do want to point out, first of all, we all have a collection of quotes to this, and we can add some more from various other people who've spoken on this recently. Since we're in the United States, I picked two liberal Democrats who have used the term and denounced BDS as anti-Semitism. And particularly, this is for the two slides at the bottom, two images at the bottom. Stop Zionism, boycott Israel. This is not about occupation. This is not about a limited boycott only of settlement products. This is about Israel and Zionism. It's about the legitimacy of Israel. It's using of double standards. When I have discussions with people, recently I spoke to someone at Airbnb about their delisting of properties, and the main point, they said, no, this isn't BDS, we're against BDS, this is part of a general worldwide corporate social responsibility campaign and occupied territories and suffering of people. But in fact, when they issued that statement, there was no place else in the world that this applied to. And by being part of using the symbols of boycotts, they are in fact feeding into that, whether they call it BDS or not. And BDS is about ending occupation. Okay, that's a political policy statement, but then it goes to end apartheid. And back in when apartheid was first applied to Israel and continues to be, this is not about policies, this is about Israel being defined as an apartheid state, going back to the Durban NGO declaration of 2001. And the third one, refugees' right of return, which is essentially meaning no more state of Israel as a Jewish state. Those are the elements of BDS, and therefore it certainly qualifies in that framework. And these organizations are very active in the process. What you see are two reports issued in the last 2 months. Well, we're in March already, so I'll say it. One was in late November, the other one I believe was in January. The one on the right is from Amnesty International. The one on the left is from Human Rights Watch. The language that's used, Human Rights Watch, stolen land, I'll leave that to others to do the parsing of that language and why that has the connotations that it does. Amnesty, although it focused on occupation, the images here is again of Israel, of destruction, of one-sided suffering on the Palestinians. Those images, these are both BDS reports. They were both BDS reports that were focused on the tourist industry and targeting Israel. The obsessive tweeting on this, Human Rights Watch, I don't need to show that to you, we track that. Another organization of significance is the Ecumenical Accompaniment Program in Palestine and Israel, the EAPPI, which is a program which is run by the World Council of Churches. The World Council of Churches has a long history of anti-Israel and anti-Semitic activities and actions. EAPPI sends approximately a few hundred, what they call volunteers, mostly students, to the West Bank to witness Palestinian suffering. And then what they do is they go back to their home countries. Significant group comes from Scandinavia. Finland right now, Finn Church Aid is the largest funder of this, but also Sweden, Norway, and then in other countries, including Canada and the United States in a few cases, also South Africa. and these people go back and they share their testimonies about Israeli aggression and attacks on Palestinians, and then they use that in support of the BDS movement and of demonizing Israel. So there is no, what's interesting is when we questioned the World Council of Churches, criticized them, and they said, well, we do this in other places, and we asked for an example, and I believe they said, well, in Colombia we tried to do that, but it didn't work out so well, so it was a pilot program. In other words, they don't do it anyplace else in the world. It's specifically singling out Israel. Through this process, it's a form of brainwashing. They witness the Palestinian suffering. They hear a series of lectures which are, from what we can tell, and the list of lectures are secretive, but we've seen a few details of that. They get brainwashed to do the Palestinian suffering messaging, and then they go out and they do that, and that adds to the BDS process. This is some of the symbolism that is used to your Facebook post by an EAPPI volunteer, and the language going from criticism of Israel to the Jewish lobby very quickly. Background of the World Council of Churches and Anti-Semitism. Since I'm running out of time, I will just leave that for the paper. Their support of the Kairos Project. They responded, and this is the point that I want to make, we've had a dialogue with them about this, a form of a dialogue, I should say. A lot of canceled meetings, one meeting that took place, and a series of posts back and forth, which some of you can see on Twitter. The point that I want to make is all the way on the on the left-hand side, because part of that was, the argument is, what you're doing anti-Semitic? Here's the case that it is in fact violation of the IHRA definition, and their response is the WCC is aware of the definition of anti-Semitism adopted and promoted by the IHRA, which is described by the IHRA as a non-legally binding working definition. That's the emphasis. It's not legally binding, and therefore it's irrelevant to us. We note that the IHRA guidelines apply to applying double standards. WCC expects all nations, so this is not about Israel, you're going to universalize it and therefore whitewash the degree to which they're violating these standards and the degree to which Israel is the subject of a very specific campaign. These are some of the tweets that went back and forth on that issue. The IRA, however, the way that you at NGO Monitor go about labeling any criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic. Well, there's a term that we've heard many times in the last couple of days. We're very familiar that we don't have to deal with the substance. We will simply throw back at you the phrase that you are trying to silence all criticism by calling it anti-Semitic. They refuse to get into the details of that. I'll skip the deadly exchange since Miriam Ellman did that in great detail. Here are some examples. I'll just leave these on for 30 seconds. One from the equivalent, I guess, of the Jewish Voice for Peace in France, which got funded for a project on racism, and then it was the theme which the project was Zionism is racism. The funding was withdrawn. Here are a couple of tweets that were done by a young woman by the name of Manal Tamimi, who was at that time employed by an NGO funded by a number of European countries. The symbolism is very obvious here. At some point, actually 2 years ago, I'll just go down to the end here, in response to some of these activities, the EU adopted some guidelines, specifically in the case of funding for Palestinian NGOs. And this I'm going to end because I think I'll end on a semi-positive note here, that there is some understanding. Katerina's not here anymore, but she knows about this, and we've talked about this. The language was in this report, December 2017, preventing EU support civil society organizations engaged in activities inciting to hatred and or violence, requiring strict compliance with the EU framework decision on racism and xenophobia, and then specifically funding that is provided for NGOs must take into account and examine whether the organization, this is new, up until now, up until this document, the European Union response was always, we fund projects, we don't fund organizations. If the project that we're funding is not linked in any way to any of these anti-Semitic activities or activities which you might find to violate the guidelines, then it's not our problem. We are not responsible, nor do we claim to examine the organization as an organization. So you can give a lot of money, millions of euros, to an organization, this was prior to December 2017, that does a lot of anti-Semitism, including some of the cartoons that I showed you and other things. But if the project that we're defined is completely different, that's okay. That has changed, at least on paper. And it's not considered a high-level risk, it's a medium-level risk, but that one can argue about the subjectivity of that. But it means that the EU now is supposed to be doing online and offline checks during the selection phase of the projects to look to see whether the organization which they are planning to fund, or which they usually have funded in the past, is involved in these kinds of violations or contradictions to the working group, the working definition of IHRA. So I think there is some room, particularly in terms of the European Union, for its funding of the NGOs that I cited earlier, and from there to other European countries in particular, to be more attentive in considering these factors in the funding process. Getting the UN to use these, the working definition in its activities is obviously going to be more difficult, but the Secretary General, having at least engaged on the IHRA definition, does suggest that there's room for movement in that direction as well.